So, the Series S is a real thing, which I've known about for a few months now, and mentioned it in passing to not spoil the thunder of Microsoft. So much so that I actually thought it had been announced already at one point. Anyway, now that every man and his friend's dog knows that it exists, I can talk a little more on the info I have, and more importantly, give a sample of what we can expect from it. Now let's start with what it is not. This is not a handheld Switch-like device, not from what I've been told and seen anyway. No, this is a small form factor box that will sit in a space easily and simply, almost like a retro box in modern form. Not far from it when you consider the amount of titles it will play from 4 generations of Xbox consoles, thanks to the incredible backwards compatibility from Microsoft, and helped by a Game Pass subscription. It will really be a Netflix of gaming. A horrible cliche, I know, but as its core, this is a smaller, less powerful Series X. That way it will be cut from the exact same mould. This means the specs, as I know of them anyway, which are not confirmed, mind, are a Zen 2 3.6 GHz 8-core 16-thread CPU, an RDNA 2 Navi 2 GPU which has 20 active cores or compute units. I do not know clock speeds, and these can always change slightly anyway, including the CPU, which I would estimate somewhere between 1.6 and 1.8 GHz. I'm going to go midstream and say it's going to be 1.75 GHz. That's my expectation. Now remember, this GPU is exactly the same as the Series X, all the way down to that ray tracing functionality that it has, but it is obviously cut back. In addition to this, it will still have the same SSD-centric storage system, all that Xbox Velocity architecture, BC Pack technology, and everything else strapped in with hardware decompression will all work as intended, and it will come with a cutback 10 GB of GDDR6 RAM, which could be configured in a couple of ways, but due to the vast bandwidth reduction requirements of the S over the X, I would imagine they will go with a below configuration, or at least the one you can see on screen, the construction, to mirror as close as possible the memory controller and node construction of its bigger brother. This obviously means we'll get 4 GDDR6 16GB nodes and 2 8GB nodes, delivering a maximum 192-bit bus for the 6GB, that's at 336GB per second bandwidth across those 6 chips. And then the remaining 1 gig left in those 4 chips, that's 16GB chips, the ones I'm on about, they'll actually provide 128-bit bandwidth, giving the slower 4GB of RAM access to a total of 224 GB per second. Now, obviously this is reduced from the overall quality we've seen on the X, but it doesn't need it because it's not targeting those kind of levels of throughput and fill rate. Now, bearing in mind much of this will be used by the operating system and the CPU, that smaller portion, then it should leave the lion's share free for the fastest RAM on the GPU, which needs the most of it. Now, this will still be a split pool, but due to the reduction in pixel fill rate and frame rates at that higher level, it should actually affect it even less than the X and have far more than what the CPU really needs to work with. So I expect the first is the most likely. Now, this config also nicely matches many of the AMD Navi cards on the market, with my RX 5600 XT here nicely showing what 336GB per second via its 6GB VRAM allocation can muster. And like I say, this perfectly matches the potential Series S allocation. Now, to help us also draw this closer, I have downclocked the 5600 XT to 4.5 teraflops via a maximum 980 MHz core clock. This gives us an almost perfect match for the Series S if the core on that runs at 1750 MHz, which would be my close expectation for the frequency within that via its 20 compute units. Now, to compare how close this downclock is to a lower compute unit GPU, which the S will be, I can compare it within this pseudo Series S guys against my 22 compute unit 5500 XT, which has a 128-bit bus versus the 192 of the 5600, but it's got 8GB at a maximum of 224GB per second. Now, using the shadow of the Tomb Raider benchmark to get perfectly aligned results, a good example of games to come mind with it using the foundation engine from its creators in Crystal Dynamics, which they're preparing for the next generation within the Avengers game, hitting all current platforms but actually coming with dual modes on the free next generation console upgrade that it will receive. Now, this may be a patch as Rise did when it hit PS4 Pro and Xbox One X. Go over and check my other videos out about the development of next generations, how all that works, in case you need to have an understanding of how this might be. But I suspect a patch would work. The PS5 and almost certainly the Series S and X will enable an enhanced graphics mode that adds extra effects, details and textures alongside a resolution mode, all wrapped into one single solution. And then it will also have a performance mode which runs at a dynamic 4K resolution that targets 60 FPS that we know of on the PS5. Now I fully expect this mode on the Series S to target 1080p, which will be the sweet spot for this little machine at that frame rate. Using Shadow of the Tomb Raider as the base, we can see that the 5500 XT at just over 5 teraflops is nigh on identical to the 4.5 teraflop pseudo Series S here. Now the spikes in maximum rates are likely the extra bandwidth that the 5600 XT donor here has. It does highlight a good example of how many compute units and clock speeds actually scale within the same architecture. Now this side-by-side run gives a 2 to 3% delta between them, so it's a good validation of the 5600 XT emulating a lower compute unit GPU by using that underclocking to get there. Obviously this can falter up and down, as we see with a similar identical run with Gears 5 to prove this, with actually the 5500 just beating the 5600 here. Now as such, we have a good base to move forward with as a benchmark on the GPU side. On the CPU side though, we can use our Zen 2 3600 6-core 12-thread CPU, which is clocked at 3.5 GHz to show how well the machine can run modern games, which can be CPU bound at times, such as The Witcher 3 and possibly Cyberpunk 2077. Now the entire machine is matched with 16 GB of DDR4 RAM, which offers 25.6 GB per second to the CPU via its 3.2 GHz clock rate, demonstrating that the potential 224 GB per second contested bandwidth within the S machine should not be an issue most of the time. So we are set then with our donor machine to reflect the S specs, and now we can get into the exciting part and actually test it. Remember though that even though the RDNA 2 architecture is actually better and is backwards compatible with RDNA 1 and of course GCN of the current gen consoles, aside core frequency and fabrication improvements, these will run current code the same as new code clock for clock. Otherwise, it will actually need to be written to take advantage of the core architectural changes it offers. Again, check out my software developments video series to learn more on this. But in essence, a 4.5 teraflop RDNA 1 card should not make a huge difference to a 4.5 teraflop RDNA 2 card that is running the exact same code engine aside any core benefits built into the logic of it. Now from here on out, I will be referring to the downclocked 5600 XT and the entire PC as the Series S. But remember, this is all just theoretical for now, but still enlightening for the road ahead. Are you ready? Let's take a look. Now even though the Series S will support all the features and functions of the X, including ray tracing, I only have the RTX 2070 for now to test ray tracing, and as this is a completely different architecture over Navi, and we've not yet seen what Navi ray tracing performance is like, I won't be testing this today. I will be testing a game that uses ray tracing, actually much better than 95% of games thus far, through 4A's excellent and technically impressive Metro Exodus. Running the high PC spec at 1080p and 1440p, we can see a like-for-like example of what we can get. The first thing is the massive CPU boost makes 60 FPS a reality here on the S over the limited Jaguar micro architecture within the current consoles. 7 plus something cores at 1.75 GHz, or slightly more on the Pro machines, is now boosted to 7 cores and 14 threads at 3.5 GHz at a base level. But core instructions per clock, cache and other pipeline improvements here mean that we should see upwards of around 4 times the current gen performance, which left this game largely locked to 30 FPS with tearing even on the Pro and X, and that's likely why it didn't have a 1080p 60 mode. Now not so here with this 4 teraflop GPU now able to push this into a pretty much locked 60 FPS here. I've capped this at level as it really is the reality for what this machine will target, as that rare 120 FPS titles will be left for the X and the PS5 only, as they have far more GPU grunt to make that a reality. Now the 1440 level is a stretch too far though, with it rarely hitting 60 and hovering around that mid section of 45 FPS level, meaning it could easily offer a 1440-30 option and a 1080-60 option, something I think we will see a great deal more often in the next generation. Now based on this level, it may even be able to run a dynamic 1440-30 or 60, or at the very least a 1080-30 option with that ray tracing GI enabled, and that would be an absolutely tremendous start for this little 4 teraflop machine, right? Well, let's take a look at some more games. So bringing us back to Shadow of the Tomb Raider and that foundation engine, here we can see running a 1080p target at the high settings, we get 60 FPS pretty much locked on this 4 teraflop machine, and we get just under 60 FPS, averaging again around that perfect 45. So again, dynamic resolution scaling would be a perfect compromise here to deliver that performance level as expected on this next generation of machines. But because that CPU is much more powerful, it's not holding it back. And if you took on a dynamic solution or lowered some of the settings, you might even be able to get closer to that 60 FPS at 1440p. And also just to briefly touch on what the S would perform like compared to the Xbox One X, you can see here that at 1080p, the same or slightly lower settings, it's almost identical performance, arguably slightly better at certain points, but the average across this section is around 58, 57 FPS, so it's slightly better on this underpowered 4.5 teraflop GPU. So I don't think anyone's going to be concerned about it performing around the same level with additional benefits of the Xbox One X, but that additional Zen 2 CPU is what will really help it out. So I think on average it will perform better than the X across the board, and that will include backwards compatibility. So next up, let's try an engine that's really designed to push up to 1000 FPS, far more limited here at 60, but you can see that at 1440p, no dynamic resolution here at all. It generally has enough headroom to hit close to 60 FPS. The average is somewhere around the high 58, so it's not bad. It does have a couple of points in the glory kills where it can dip below that, but overall it's not too bad. But 1800p is just a little bit too far for this particular machine. But if you were to turn on dynamic resolution, which the machine supports, and obviously is going to be highly common across the next generation titles, even more than we see now, then we can see at a full 4K, it's just not enough power to run this at a dynamic resolution scaling at 3840 by 2160. It averages somewhere around that 45 FPS. But if you were to target this more towards the 3200 by 1800 dynamic resolution, then we can see the performance is massively improved, almost to that target of 60 FPS. Now remember, this is running on the ultra nightmare settings, so not the top but close to the top, much better than what the consoles run. So you could knock that back a couple of rungs on shadows, particle effects and bokeh depth of field, and you'd probably get this running at a locked 60 FPS at that 3200 by 1800 dynamic resolution scaling. And this is where I think the machine's really going to push forward on. VRS, all of those mesh shading processes and dynamic resolution scaling really is going to make this particular machine a very powerful one that actually targets much better than 1080p across the board, and it makes 60 FPS because of the CPU and the GPU a reality all the time. And this also makes games such as Wolfenstein and others, Doom and many other older titles, 120 FPS will not be out of the question on this particular machine. You might have to lower the settings quality, but the CPU and the GPU and the bandwidth will certainly mean that 120 FPS or VRSS options will be an option on this machine if developers choose to target it. But I expect to see it held and privileged for the Series X and obviously the PS5. And this is because modern game engines are not like they used to be. They're no longer designed around a specific piece of hardware or specification or just lines of code to run the game. They're actually designed to scale across multiple platforms, and this includes Sony's first party. And that means you can just make those configurations and run them on multiple pieces of hardware and get better performance, just like Detroit here. You could run this at 1440p at 85% scaling, so a dynamic resolution scaling, or just downscaled and back up. Now 85% of 1440p gives us a 60 60 FPS. Just for those wanting to know, is approximately 2368 by 1332, so close enough to be good enough to look like 1440p, as you can see here. But the performance metric means that Detroit, a very impressive looking title in terms of visual quality, certainly doesn't struggle to run at 60 FPS. That 1% low is micro stutters, which happen occasionally when it's loading new scenes or flipping between the two. This is common on every piece of hardware I've ever known in my life, so I wouldn't get too hung up on that particular metric. But 60 FPS is a real option here, and again, it's visually even better than the checkerboard solution running on the Pro, because there's an additional benefit of running everything here at the highest setting, so it looks better from texture quality, effect quality, particles, and all of that. And this makes it a very impressive piece of kit, but it means that it comes in at that cheaper lower end of the spectrum. But because of the modern engine design and how developers make games now, more powerful machines, and then scale them back down to run on various platforms, this means that the market will be able to accept this type of machine very simply, very easily, and it will even include things by going back to older versions and just changing the INI file that configures the settings on that particular hardware running on this one, and then you get those extra benefits over and above. And that means that these kind of titles and many others are an option. Now, this means that 4K games, at modern games anyway, are out of bounds for this particular machine, but 1800p at 30 FPS is not. Take something as demanding as Red Dead Redemption 2 here. 1440p 60 is off the cards. Even 1080p 60 is difficult for this card and many cards. But setting it close to the console settings here and running it at 30 FPS as a target refresh rate, we can see that it actually delivers that pretty much locked at 30 FPS with no issues at all. There's a couple of dips, but it's pretty much identical to the performance on the consoles, including both the Pro and the X. Now, the fact that it fully supports things like ray tracing, VRSS, mesh shading, and everything else that's going to come along with RDNA 2, it makes it a very attractive proposition for anyone wanting to get in next generation hardware, and that will include that SSD, all of the BC pack, the velocity architecture, and the SFS texture compression techniques that will all be there to deliver even more performance from this cheap solution. Whether it's $299, whether it's $349, it's still cheap. It's still one of the cheapest entries into next generation we will ever see, and I don't think it'll really hold the market back. In fact, I'm almost convinced it won't. No more and no less than the Series X will. Simply, the Series X will just be pushing resolution much higher and possibly ray tracing much higher as well. These are the two compromises I expect to see from this machine, but if you are looking to jump into the Xbox next generation marketplace, then I think the Series S could be, or the Lockhart, could be the machine that really makes the most bang for buck sense. And you know that I'm all about value, and this to me is the one piece of hardware that I'm going to keep a very close eye on to see just what comes out of it.
Stop! Stop! Please! Please! I beg you, stop! Come, sir. You won the fight already. Surely that's enough.
What business is it of yours?
No business. No business, sir, but please, I beg you.
Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this look forward into the next generation market, and if you did like this or anything else I've put together, remember I'm completely self-funded and independent, so if you can, share this with your friends, anyone on forums, like, subscribe, and ring the bell to be notified of new videos as I put them up. But for now, I'm out, and I'll catch you on the next one.
To decide.